So, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Unhooked. I am your host, Jeremy Lipkowitz, and I'm very excited to be joined here today with James Oliver. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, mate. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah. There are so many directions we could take this conversation today, and a lot of topics I want to dive into. And so, I guess just at the start, we might have to have you back on for a second episode if we don't get to everything today. Um, just to give the listeners a sense of some of the directions, I know you said you're willing to talk about your own history with porn and kind of how you managed that history and that relationship. Um, you've talked a lot about shame, which is a huge topic for porn addiction and recovery and just men's issues in general, some of the stuff that I want to dive into. But to give the listeners a sense of who you are and what you're about, I'm curious just if you could tell us, what are you up to these days? What are you doing? Who is James Oliver?
Sure. So I think whenever I get asked this question, I realize that there's quite a few hats that I wear. In a kind of professional realm, I am I guess like a self-leadership and life coach for men. So I help men kind of do the dark, kind of dirty, nitty-gritty work of things like healing shame, getting to the root cause of challenges and issues around things like self-worth, and really kind of support them on a journey of kind of dealing with the issues and the challenges that none of us really realized that we would have to face in maybe adulthood, or just identifying as men. So that's my kind of coaching work as a whole. I work with men kind of on a one-to-one basis. I also lead and facilitate a men's group called One Brotherhood. So that is, again, just kind of bringing that community element into it and kind of bringing men into safe spaces to come together to really kind of do the work, in community, which is, always, incredibly powerful and very, very needed. You've actually caught me on the first day of launching my own podcast. So it's just been launched today. Me and a very, very good friend of mine, Jamie, have just launched a podcast called The Boys Toilets. So that is just, again, all things kind of conversations that men and boys should be a part of, need to stop shying away from, and really kind of getting involved in with an intention of kind of educating, inspiring, holding accountable, calling forward men, into those really necessary conversations. And outside of that, I am a 33-year-old man who lives on the south coast of England. I work mainly between here and in London. And I love, what do I love? I'm a big football fan, soccer. I am a keen, I love to look after myself, be in the gym, all of the good stuff, looking after my body, looking after my mind. I live by the sea, so I get in lots of cold water. All the stuff, really.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you on is that you do seem like a very kind of inspiring person. And, I don't want to call you a role model, but I think inspiring not just for these things that you've mentioned at the end, the gym and taking care of yourself, but really inspiring for how you show up around these more vulnerable issues, talking about your emotions, talking about shame and how to overcome shame and connecting with other men. I think there's a lot of key, just valuable nuggets that people can take away from how you're showing up in the world. And I imagine, with almost everyone, a lot of wisdom comes through suffering and going through dark experiences. And I'm just curious, what's the kind of the short story of what got you here today? What was it that brought you to this line of work?
That's a good question. I think, to try and keep a long story short, I think throughout my 20s, I spent a lot of that time kind of unconsciously, without realizing, outsourcing my happiness, my joy, my identity, to others. So I was seeking happiness and purpose and meaning in things like friendships, my family, my dad, my partners. And yeah, I think I was unconsciously kind of expecting that if I show up for them and I support them and do everything I can to make them happy or be a good friend or a good boyfriend or partner, that it would, I would get that in return. And it was almost this kind of like conditional way of showing up in the world.
Hmm.
And yeah, kind of unknowingly, again, like without realizing it, I had absolutely no sense of my own power, no kind of purpose. I would go through these periods where, maybe if a relationship kind of fell apart, I would fall apart. I'd really lose all sense of self and identity. That happened a couple of times in my 20s. I had some, those breakups that really rock you and kind of shake you to your core. And I also, I think one of the big kind of moments, the big catalysts for my own kind of pain and the journey I went on to heal that was at 30. So on my 30th birthday, I walked away from a relationship with my dad. I kind of pulled myself away from that and just said, I don't really understand why at this time, but this relationship is too hard. It's too painful for me. I don't think I articulated it that kindly at the time. I was very angry and very hurt. But I walked away from that relationship and didn't speak to my dad for the best part of 2.5 years. We have since reconnected, very much more on a kind of equal, just a more fair and respectable like terms, definitely more on my terms. And but it was in that period of kind of 2.5 years where by taking space, I also in that period took space from things like relationships and sex. Really sat with just when you abstain from things or when you give yourself space from things, you really give yourself space to have like you will literally suddenly have these realizations. And I'd have these moments of like huge inspiration or where like the penny would drop, or I just have these huge breakthrough moments. Sometimes it was in intentional practice, whether it be in meditation or whether it be just journaling. Sometimes I would just wake up one morning and I would suddenly realize why I've shown up in the way that I have in all of my past relationships. And it would just be out of the blue. So yeah, it's been a real journey to really uncover and heal a lot. Yeah, I talked about shame, kind of became quite attuned to what shame is and how it showed up in my life. Really, I think it was about 2021, like midway through 2021, I did a lot of identifying my own shame. And yeah, went through an incredibly colorful, I would say, journey to kind of work through and heal a lot of that. And it was it was incredible. So yeah, I think that's, you talk about kind of the wisdom that you kind of pick up along the way. I think that definitely informs a lot of the work that I do. I use some frameworks. I do a lot of like IFS parts-based work with clients. But one thing that I think I really love more than anything doing is being able to, when I notice that one of my clients or someone I'm talking to, it doesn't even have to be someone that I'm working with, when they are, sorry, my doorbell's just gone, so sorry about that. When I'm speaking to someone and I can feel that what they are going through or the challenges that they are having are something that I have been through and worked through and struggled with myself. I love nothing more than to really kind of like show that person that I'm in there with them. I've been where they are, and just to help them kind of not feel as alone with that and guide and support them through it. So
yeah, I think that's such a huge healing thing for so many, especially for men who, women, have their own struggles, but one of the things that they tend to have that men don't is places to connect with other women. There are women's circles, there are women's retreats. Women tend to kind of connect more and talk about emotions, but men for a long time, this is coming more and more and more, men's circles and men's retreats, but most men don't have places where they can be heard and be seen and recognize that they're not alone. And so these feelings of isolation and shame can be quite overwhelming. I'm curious for you, shame is something you've talked about a lot. What do you wish more people knew about shame?
it's a really good question. What I wish more people knew about shame. I think, let me see if I can word this right, but I think probably the thing that I would like most people, or I would like people to know about shame, is how well it hides.
Mm,
Um, I think many of us don't realize how much shame we carry.
mm,
Um, when we hear the word shame, I don't know how many of us say to ourselves, "Oh, I'm really ashamed of this part of myself," or "I'm really ashamed of that thing that happened," or "this part of who I am." I don't think we use that language in the way that we either speak to ourselves or describe ourselves. Or even if we're sharing in a circle, I don't think many of us would really ever naturally l- express ourselves by saying or connecting with this idea of being ashamed of something.
mm,
Um, but that in itself is the nature of shame. Shame wants you to hide things. And so shame itself will hide under so many different kind of masks. It could be, that you are ashamed of the way that you think about something. So therefore, you obviously won't express that. But generally, you'll just hide that and you won't share that. Or it could be that you are ashamed of, or it could be that you carry shame over. I'm trying to think of some examples of my own stuff, but um,
I think, part of, I kind of know what you're talking about, this feeling that
mm,
shame, it's almost like we hide it from ourselves, even, not just that we hide it from other people, but we don't even
mm,
recognize that it's shame, that it's just,
yeah,
it's this internalized disgust with ourselves, this feeling of, oh, I'm broken, I'm wrong, I
mm,
can't show somebody this, but we don't actually recognize, oh, I'm feeling ashamed of this behavior. It's just this feeling of, oh, I'm a monster, I got to get away. Nobody can see this. And we're kind of believing
exactly.
this story of being broken.
Mm. Well, that's it. And sorry, thank you for kind of helping me find my words there. Shame hides under things. Shame hides in narratives about ourselves, and generally that would be things like I'm broken. There's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. And yeah, even those in themselves, we might not be aware that we carry those beliefs about them. They can be so deeply entrenched within our identity and the way that we feel about ourselves that we believe them to be inherently true.
Mm,
And so really shame hides right, like really deep at the core of who we are. And it's kind of this, what ultimately is, it's a wound and it's a belief that's been formed around that wound.
mm,
Um, but I think maybe this is another thing to share around what I wish more people knew about shame is that it's not ours. The beliefs that we carry that are entrenched in shame are things that we learned about ourselves or convinced ourselves of as a result of something happening to us. That they're not actually true.
mm,
Um, so when we learn or when something happens to us, a lot of these beliefs, these kind of core wounds and these beliefs that get formed in childhood. So before we kind of had the self-awareness and the autonomy to kind of think for ourselves, um, a lot of the time we learn that, oh, maybe we're not good enough or we're not worthy or we don't deserve something. Um, because when we're children, and let's just say you don't get what you want or you don't get your needs met by a caregiver or a parent, well, we don't have the ability to analyze a situation. A great example is the one that I use is, my dad used to come home from working all week and he would come home on a Friday, usually kind of in the evening around 6 o'clock. My dad would get home. And let's just say, for example, I'm really excited to see my dad. I know he's coming home on a Friday, but when he gets home, he's had a really tough day at work. He's really tired. He's irritable. And I go to meet him at the door and he brushes past me, doesn't acknowledge me. Maybe he's even a bit dismissive. Well, if I'm 6 years old and I've just seen my dad do that to me, I don't have the ability to assess that situation objectively. I don't have the ability to say, Dad must have had a really hard day. I wonder what's going on there. Maybe I'll go
mm,
and check on him and see if he's okay. As children, we have quite a narcissistic tendency, and that is to make things about us that aren't. And generally, the conclusion that gets drawn in that scenario by that child is, what have I done?
mhm,
Oh no, I've done something to upset Dad. I must have done something wrong. There must be something wrong with me. I must be a bad child. I must have upset my dad. And so it's in those little moments that those kind of, unfortunately, those deep wounds get kind of instilled. And because we get so immersed in them that they become our reality from a very young age. It's very, very hard to step outside of those as we get older and kind of begin to identify how they impact our perception of the world and ourselves.
Yeah, it's like that old analogy, that old metaphor of the fish, and you ask a fish, "How's the water?" And it says, "What water?" It's like when you're swimming in that sense of shame, or you're swimming in that sense of being broken your whole life. If you've been living with that for 25 years, 30 years, 40 years, it's a part of the reality that you swim in. You don't even recognize that it's a narrative that you're buying into and kind of throwing fuel on the fire of. I'm curious, I was listening to one of your conversations, and you were talking about one of your core wounds of this feeling of, like something is wrong with you. You're broken in some way. You've done something wrong. And you kind of described it as, the words that would come into your head when you've done something wrong is like, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" And just that subtle way that we treat ourselves of like, "What the fuck is wrong with you? Like, what? I can't believe you did that." And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about, like, how did that show up, and how did it impact your day-to-day life as an adult?
Yeah. So again, talk about being like the fish in water and not realizing that was the water that I had been swimming in for most of my life. And I didn't realize until I didn't become conscious of it until, about 2 years ago. And so, it would show up in almost every area of my life, from even like the day-to-day stuff. So things like if I was playing sport, or, I haven't played it very much, but I used to play a bit of golf. And if I ever hit a bad shot, it wouldn't always be, but there would sometimes be if I got triggered and I had attached meaning to my performance and the outcome, and I wasn't just playing for the fun of it, usually playing with my dad, believe it or not. But if I would hit a bad shot, the almost immediate response, or the thought that would come up in my head was, "What the fuck is wrong with you?"
Mm.
And it was so vicious and so nasty. And
Mm.
I hadn't realized that, because there's two people in that scenario, that it's the one saying it, but there's the one hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
And, you are obviously the same person, you're both of those, but I wasn't able to step out of and see that conversation going on. I was only able to kind of be in it and a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't notice that or understand what was happening there for a very long time. It would happen anytime I would be clumsy, drop something, forget to do something, whether it was work, whether it be take the washing out, go to the shops. Like, there was just this constant kind of like hum of that energy kind of going around in my inner system. And
Yeah.
it was a couple of years ago that when I started to identify this, I remembered, I think it was very shortly after I'd come back from my first ever experience with plant medicine. I went on a retreat in 2022, and I literally witnessed myself, had this kind of out of body experience when I hadn't gone to the gym one afternoon, and I delayed it and I procrastinated for a few hours. And then when I finally got off, the sofa to say, right, I'm going to go to the gym now, I stood up and I said to myself, "What the fuck is wrong with you? You should have done this 4 hours ago." And almost immediately after that, this second voice came in, and it just went, I said to myself, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" I caught myself. And then this other, like, more compassionate, soft, loving voice just went, "Absolutely nothing." And I kind of laughed to myself, and I kind of I wasn't laughing at the voice. I was just seeing that situation unfold in this kind of out of body way. And it was like a small moment, but it's definitely evidence of that kind of shift in terms of how I relate to myself and how I speak to myself.
Yeah. I think I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because one of the things that we all know this is true. The inner critic can be so kind of harsh on ourselves, and we're so abusive. And you said it was like vicious, and it can really be this harsh, abusive, we're kind of violent towards ourselves. And it's easy for us to see other people treating themselves this way and to be like, "Yo, like, don't be so hard on yourself." It's like you missed a day at the gym. It's all right. Like you're still a good person. And it's so easy for us to see it in other people and to provide that compassion. But yet the way that we treat ourselves is so abusive and so violent. And you also mentioned the ways that we kind of hide this from ourselves. And I imagine, and hide it from other people. I imagine that most people probably had no idea that you had this self-abusive kind of behavior, that you probably kind of, put on the facade of holding it together and looking like, oh, I'm cool. I got it together. I go to the gym. I'm confident. I can go talk to women. But the inner experience can be so different. Was that kind of true for you, or?
Yeah, well, that's exactly how things would end up playing out in things like romantic partnerships. So I, in that period of, being, not having my dad in my life, taking some space, really kind of going inwards and yeah, exploring and looking back and kind of diving deep into all of these parts of my own life, my history, my story, my relationship with myself. I recognized that the way that I had historically shown up in partnerships, I had this really common pattern of getting into a relationship after after that kind of 6-month period where, the honeymoon period's come and gone. Well, at that point, things would start to kind of, like the cracks would begin to show. And what was happening there is I had managed to wear a mask for so long of being all of those things that you just said. Whether it be confident, whether it be loving, all of the things. But obviously, in the beginning part of a relationship, you only present all of the perceivably good parts of who you are, or acceptable parts of who you are, or the parts that you deem to be worthy of love.
Mm.
And you actively, often unconsciously, hide the parts of yourself that you don't deem to be worthy of being loved. And when you form relationships with people, there's only so long that you can hide that stuff for. And because I was not aware or intentionally or consciously hiding these parts of myself, I was just so ashamed of things like my anger. I was ashamed of my inner narrative and my inner critic. I was ashamed of the way that I spoke to myself, but only if other people saw it. It was kind of, it's okay if we keep this to ourselves, but if anyone else sees or, kind of knows that I speak to myself or I have these parts of me, well, they're going to judge me and they're going to think less of me. And so again, you can hear like that shame it's just operating in that sneaky, like, we can't let anyone see this. There's no way we can let anyone see that this part of you exists. And so, it was really, it was mind blowing to kind of, and you mentioned that part of, if you saw other people speaking to each other, like if you saw two people speaking to each other in the way that you spoke to yourself, that's the exact realization that I had when I first stepped outside of those conversations with myself. I pictured two people, on the other side of the road or sat down in the same restaurant as you, one speaking to the other the way that I speak to myself. And I thought, if I saw two people and one was speaking to the other in that way, I would have to get up and go to them and intervene. I would have to say, I don't care what's going on right now. You cannot speak to people like that. It would it actually kind of invoked this sense of like fierce, like wanting to defend someone because the other person was being quite abusive. And it was when I realized that I spoke to myself that way that I was like, oh shit.
Yeah.
Like it was just a big kind of like mind-blowing moment.
Yeah. And I think it highlights just how important these self-awareness practices are of mindfulness, meditation, journaling, going on retreats, plant medicine. It's interesting that you kind of brought up this concept of how we often unintentionally, we don't want to show the unacceptable parts of ourselves. And it's so funny because even when we are aware of that pattern, we still do. I still do it all the time, in a new friendship, a new kind of part, when I'm meeting someone, I hide these parts of myself, and it's only when I feel really safe. And I think when we meet people who are so vulnerable in that way, it can be such a breath of fresh air to just experience someone who is able to be themselves, and able to open up about that. I remember when I was on a plant medicine journey down in Peru, going through these intense ceremonies, and on one of the most difficult nights, that I think it was the third ceremony, that I had this kind of mental breakdown. It was a very difficult night for me. And in the sharing circle the next day, just all the armor was off, all the masks were gone. And in this big circle of 25 other people, I just broke down crying and was kind of it was this experience of deep vulnerability where I just let all the armor off and was, I haven't, I don't know if I've ever cried as hard as I did that day, maybe when I was a little kid, like 6 years old, but it was so healing to fully let the armor off and to fully just be so vulnerable and to say what was really on my mind, all the fears, the insecurities. And I think that's something we need, because so many of us are living our whole lives behind these masks where it's a prison, right? It's this feeling of I can't be seen the way I am. And that is so much pressure to live a whole life where you feel like you have to hide parts of yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just two things that I want to maybe speak to on that. And I'll make sure to do my best to remember that there's two. The first one is maybe just to echo or speak to a very similar experience that I had on the plant medicine retreat I did in Ibiza in 22. Anytime I speak about plant medicine, I always like to caveat it with that it is very much, I'm not here just telling everyone to go and do, go jump onto a psilocybin retreat or go and do ayahuasca. My experience with it was that it was the culmination of about a year's worth of deep shame and compassion work. And it was the final piece of like a year's worth of like a healing puzzle. So it kind of just jolted a few things into place for me. That being said, I had a very similar experience where I had an emotional release through a sound healing ceremony after the day after our first plant medicine ceremony. And I sobbed harder than I ever have in my life for about 20 minutes in front of a room of about 20 people. And when I was in it, I was very aware that there were other people around me, but I couldn't have cared less because I just knew that there was something in me that needed to be expressed. And when I came out of it, I sort of worked through and felt that emotion, the lightness that came from that and the relief and actually a sense of reconnection, that in feeling that I felt more connected to myself and more connected to my truth, was hard to put into words. It was a really powerful feeling. The second thing that you just mentioned was this idea of like having parts of you that people aren't. You don't want people to see certain parts of you. And for anyone who isn't familiar with the internal family systems framework, Dr. Richard Schwartz is a pioneer, a genius, just a wonderful human being who created this framework. His book, literally titled "No Bad Parts," is kind of my Bible. It speaks to that beautifully, and this idea that any parts of ourselves, our psyche, our personality, our behavior, our thoughts, our beliefs that we deem to be bad or broken or anything like that, well, it just speaks to that and just helps you realize that at their core, there are absolutely no bad parts of us. Like there are none. I just think it's such a beautiful thing when you actually connect with and you learn to understand yourself through the lens of the fact that there is no bad parts of you.
Yeah. And it's so IFS, internal family systems, for listeners of this show, you might remember in the early 20s episode, Steph Stern, where we covered IFS quite deeply. So shout out to Steph Stern in that episode. And you can go check out that episode if you want to learn more about this. It's such a good tool for healing because it especially in this, the work that I'm doing in porn addiction, but all the similar work of just healing shame, when you see that, the shame really comes from this hurt part of yourself, this like hurt child, and you can almost visualize like a 7-year-old version of yourself that didn't have the resources and is afraid and scared and was bullied as a kid or mistreated or abandoned by his parents. Whatever's going on, you can kind of have it's such a great tool for cultivating compassion towards yourself. Um, and I could kind of hear that in the way you were talking about your own experience of seeing one part of yourself yelling at this other part, like, what the fuck is wrong with you? And when you do that work, you start to see that even the one who's yelling needs love and compassion, that they're hurt and scared also. It's
Yeah,
powerful work.
definitely. Yeah, that was the parts work that I've done on myself. So that guy, that part of me that is shouting at me like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like when I've sat with him and I've had like this, again, if you've never done any of this, might sound a bit crazy because a lot of it is having literally sometimes out loud conversations with yourself or with parts of yourself. But I've had conversations with that part of myself. And in doing so, I learned that when I stopped shaming or judging that part of me for existing, what I learned was that actually his true nature and his true intention was to motivate me and to try and get me to do more, to be better, to not fail. And the reason for that was that I had this belief deep down that if I'm not good at things, people won't like me. And so if I ever did something that I was not good at, or if I failed, or if I risked looking stupid, or whatever it was, the fear was that I would get judged, rejected, embarrassed, humiliated.
Mhm.
And, there were things that happened to me in school where I felt incredibly humiliated in front of whether it's classrooms of other kids and stuff like that. So that part of me that says, what the fuck is wrong with you?
Mhm.
His intention and his real, like, deep purpose and what he's trying to do, he's doing it in a way that isn't the most productive, but his intention is to try and motivate me to protect me from those things.
Yeah.
So,
I
yeah.
think it's one of the best kind of ways to approach that is when you see one of these parts of you that's acting unskillfully, to just say like, hey, I see that you're trying to protect me. I see that you're trying to keep me safe. I see that you're trying to do your best to protect me, but you're not doing it so skillfully. So I appreciate your efforts, but you can take a back seat for now. I've got this kind of thing. But just to acknowledge like, hey, I see that you're coming from a good place, even if you're not going about it in the wisest way. I think that's really helpful. I'm curious to dive into a little bit more of the practical nitty gritty of how do we start to identify and then overcome shame. So let's say somebody is feeling a lot of shame. On this podcast, we talk a lot about sex and porn addiction. Let's say somebody is really feeling a lot of shame about that. How do we start to overcome shame?
Yeah, so a really great question. I think the first thing that comes to my mind is, I don't know who it was that said it, and you may know, but this idea that shame dies when stories are told in safe spaces. So I think first of all, identify your shame. Look at whether it's writing a list down, just journaling on. I mean, it can be a little bit of a, once you open the floodgates, it can be hard to stop because once you become attuned to shame, you'll notice it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But, maybe just start off with the big areas in your life where you feel that you have to hide. You feel like you can't be yourself. You feel like you have to either be performative or fake. Areas in life where you fear that if you tell the truth, you will be judged or rejected, so you don't. And just maybe start jotting those down. And you might notice in lots of different areas of your life that whilst they show up in different areas in different ways, you notice that they're all linked by this kind of energy of shame. So then what I would do is I would, go to and seek out spaces where you can sit and share and be open to reveal your truth, to almost admit your shame. Because the nature of shame, and one of the things that your shame will teach you or tell you, or one of the lies that it will tell you, is you're the only one that feels this way. You're the only one that thinks like this. No one else has this. There's something wrong with you. There's not something wrong with other people. It's you. And probably one of the most healing parts of unshaming, or parts of that process and that practice, is literally when you share the thing that it might be the thing that you're most ashamed of, or it might just be one of the many things that you're ashamed of. But when you declare that, and you are not only met with non-judgment and acceptance, but also when other people share or admit that they also feel that way, all of a sudden that shame just begins to kind of dissolve, because there's this big kind of moment of, oh my God, I thought I was the only one. Like, the shame itself really had been lying to me. Now, obviously, it was lying to protect you. Saying that you're the only one that feels this way is because it sees you talking about that thing as a risk. And, if you share it, you could get judged and shamed and rejected and all of those things. But that's why we go to spaces, so whether it is for men, whether it's men's circles, whether it is, retreats, or even just identifying within your own network of friends, of peers, who is safe, who you can trust to hold space for you, who will not judge you when you share what's going on in your mind and what's on your heart. Because that's something that if you're not familiar with, if you're not someone who has done that historically, which again, men really don't. We are, we've got a lot of this kind of lone wolf mentality, and a lot of that is due to fear of expressing and connecting and being vulnerable around other men. But that in itself is a way of disconnecting us. So we actually have to kind of learn and practice, how to identify where these safe spaces and who these safe people are. So yeah, I mean, it definitely can take a bit of work, to find those people if you can't think of who they are automatically in your kind of, close circle, like that's okay. But, going to somewhere like a men's circle or those sorts of spaces and events, and just sitting in circle and listening as well, because you won't be the only one sharing your shame, and you won't be the only one who turns up to those spaces feeling like you're the only one and you're alone.
Yeah, it's so beautiful what you're saying. I just want to highlight, because I wholeheartedly agree with what you've said, that the most healing thing you can do to deal with shame is to recognize that you're not alone, because that is the big lie with shame. It's, I am uniquely broken and I can't share this because if people knew, then they would think I'm a monster. And so if a couple things. One is, as you say, if you can find a group where you can hear other people talking about it, that's so healing. I think it's also one of the benefits of, podcasts like these where we're talking about men's issues. Like, you don't even have to necessarily go to a group, because that alone can be very scary for men. That's kind of maybe a step too far. Like, maybe that's 3 steps down the road. But even just listening to a podcast and hearing other men talking about, I feel really lonely, or I'm insecure when I compare myself to other people at the gym, or I'm struggling with porn addiction. And you hear it and you're like, even just hearing about it or reading about it gives you that sense of, oh, I'm not alone. The other thing is, like, it doesn't even have to be like recognizing that you're not alone, or like being around other people who struggle with the same thing. It can also just be, as you say, in a safe space. And, for me, I have a very close friend that I can tell anything to. And there is so much healing when I can share the deepest, darkest parts of my soul. And this friend doesn't even bat an eye. They just kind of are there to hold that space and hear me. And there's no judgment, because the big lie with, the shame again is if I told people I had a porn addiction or I struggle with porn addiction, they're gonna think I'm a pervert. They're gonna think I'm a monster. They're gonna think I'm dirty. And then when you tell it to someone and they're just like, oh yeah, wow, thank you for telling me. They don't run away screaming. They
Me
don't call the
too,
cops. Yeah,
sometimes.
most of the time, people are like, yeah, me too. Even men and women, right? And so you recognize
Mm.
not only you're not alone, but hey, it's safe for me to be this way, and nobody's going to run away screaming and call the cops. So I think those are kind of some things to add on to that. I'm curious. One of the things I talk about on this podcast is the difference between toxic shame, which is that feeling of I'm broken, there's something wrong with me, and what we might call healthy shame, which is the recognition when you've done something unskillful, when you've harmed someone or harmed yourself, the kind of the healthy shame that keeps you from doing that again. And I'm curious, just what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, because I I think that, and I'm trying to remember who I have seen speak to this. It might be David Bedrick does some wonderful work around shame. It might have been Gabor Mate, but they say that actually there is no such thing as healthy shame, because shame in its essence is,
Mm,
is hiding, it's darkness, it's all of those things that you just described. So I think that there is, yeah, I think that there's shame in its nature, and in its true kind of form. I don't think is healthy. I think that you can have how you relate to your shame, and how you learn to identify and relate to and react to and look at and heal and integrate your shame. I think guilt and shame are two very close things. I think that you can maybe, yeah, there's a key differential between guilt and shame, and guilt being that I've done something bad,
mm,
or shame being I did something bad, so therefore I am bad.
mm-hmm.
Um, I think that that's probably a key point to make. But yeah, I don't know why. I feel like when I hear the idea of healthy shame, something just doesn't sit right for me,
Yeah,
because I'm
yeah,
just like, I feel like shame, yeah, in and of itself is just yeah, it's something that hurts us. But I think that how we relate to our shame and identify with it is where we can learn to do something differently, and maybe
yeah,
that's kind of the healthy part of that.
yeah. And part of this is semantics, right? It's like how we define what guilt
Absolutely.
is versus what shame is. And I think the point that I just like to make is like there is a healthy component, particularly when we're engaged in unskillful behaviors. Like
Mm.
acting out. For harming other people with our sexuality. There has to be a place where we actually feel some of the pain of that. We feel the heaviness of having done something unskillful, and it's actually in Buddhist philosophy, like that pain is actually a protector. The reminder of that pain, the remembering of that pain of when we've caused harm, is actually a wholesome quality, because it kind of reminds us, like, hey, that thing I did, it wasn't skillful, and I don't want to do it again. But it is, kind of that fine line between, yeah, this doesn't mean I'm a bad person, but it's actually, I need to have some remorse for this action that I did that caused harm. I think remorse is,
Yeah, I
is
like that.
another related word. Maybe it's not guilt or shame, it's remorse. Um, but some way of kind of like recognizing when we have caused harm and getting back on the right path.
Definitely. I love that. And you are absolutely right. I'm regularly frustrated by the limitations of our language, and
Hmm.
the fact that we are ultimately feeling the same things and just approaching it from different ways. So yeah, semantics and the way that we describe things is by the by. It's, yeah, I fully agree.
Yeah. I want to make sure we get time to talk about porn, and kind of, you've mentioned, that you would be willing to just kind of share a little bit of your own experience with navigating your relationship to that. And I'm curious,
Mhm.
what was your experience with it?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, first of all, kind of I guess my introduction to porn was probably one of the really I don't think this happens anymore because we've moved on to almost purely digital based and online based porn. But my first time I ever came across porn was literally that old story of like finding a magazine in a bush by the skate park when I was about 11, I think. So, yeah. And obviously, that then becomes, you have an element of curiosity and wonder and intrigue. But no, I think around like 13, 14, yeah, I found, made my way to finding porn on the internet. And I guess kind of porn and masturbation, they go hand in hand, really. Pardon the pun. But yeah, I remembered like finding my way onto like that. We had like a computer at home, and it was when mum and dad were out, it would be like, yeah, great, let's have a little look and sort of load up some porn online. And so my access to it and my introduction to it was from a fairly young age, but nothing I wasn't sort of exposed to it from like a super like in my childhood. And I think that the thing that I reflect on is that, like many people, there was no safety around it. So there was no safety to explore it. There was no. It was very, very much a taboo topic in my house. My parents were deeply. My dad, in particular, was very, very. He was just very prudish, and if sex or anything would come on the TV, he would just get really uncomfortable. So it automatically created an air of shame around sexuality and any of those sorts of topics within our household. Something that I've done a lot of work in my own shame journey over the last couple of years to kind of heal and work through. But I think the first time that I realized that there was maybe a reliance or a dependency on porn was when I was 30. So yeah, about three and a half years ago. It was around the same time that I had stopped talking to my dad, so I was taking a lot of space in that realm of my life. And at the same time, a very good friend of mine who lived in Australia put up a post about celibacy, and I had felt called to lean into celibacy. I was a bit unsure about it. I didn't know how to do it. And he put out a bit of a call to action and a call to arms for any brothers, any men out there that were intrigued or wanted to know more. And so I ended up going through this period of celibacy. And at the beginning of that, where I was defining and kind of coming up with the framework for mine, I went like cold turkey on everything. And one of those things was masturbation and porn. And even at that point, I hadn't realized that there was a dependency on it. I'd never really questioned my relationship with it. But like many of these things, it was only once I took space from it, I was able to sit and observe it from a distance and look at what was really going on there. So, I remember something that was quite notable. During the first 2 weeks of celibacy, obviously there was no porn, no masturbation, no sex, no talking to women. It was just complete shutdown of everything. And my practice, my self-pleasure, I wouldn't have called it that at the time, but like what I would have called wanking, like I would go to sleep. It was every single night. I would get into bed. I wasn't turned on. I wasn't in any way, I wasn't even thinking about it. And I had just fallen into this habit of every single night, just as I'm getting into bed, load up a porn website, put something on, and I would just do it to get to sleep. And so it was probably every night. And so when I started my celibacy, I went 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, I remembered that I didn't have any erections. I had like 2 in the space of 2 weeks. So I wasn't waking up hard. I wasn't finding myself turned on with any visual stimulus if something was on TV, or obviously I wasn't looking at porn. But to notice that I had become that disconnected from my body was alarming. And don't get me wrong, I took it as great feedback. I looked at it as data and I was like, cool, okay, so yeah, again, got curious what's going on here. But yeah, I also realized how much I'd become dependent on the visual stimulus of what porn gave me. And so that was where I went, oh, okay, so I wonder how that's impacting my, partnered sex, like how that's impacting the way that I, am physically intimate, what I'm looking for in my partners. Um, and, if I'm being really honest with myself, yeah, I think, I realized that it impacted like the way that I would look at women. So it definitely made me look at women through the physical lens. It put an unrealistic expectation on how women should look. So I was effectively accidentally adopting quite a shameful or shaming um, mindset around the way that I believed women should look in order to appeal to me.
Mm.
So lots of the kind of hypersexual, really unrealistic bodies that you see in porn. I was looking to find that in partners and within, women that I would date or have sex with. It made me objectify women.
Mm-hmm.
It influenced the way that I perceived a woman's body. I don't think I was ever, overtly disrespectful in the way I communicated to women or spoke to women. I think I was always mindful of that. But yeah, it was really informing and shaping what was going on underneath the surface. What my expectations of women were, how they should look, what they should be doing in sex. And yeah, that really fucked me up.
Yeah. It's one of the things that is so kind of devious about porn addiction as opposed to other addictions is how many of these consequences are so subtle and so hard to see because they build up over time. And it's very, it's these like just a little bit every day. It's like over time, it actually really rewires our brain to, have these unrealistic expectations of women, to start to objectify women more. There's this one study that I've mentioned before on the podcast where there are regions of our brain that are associated with speaking to people and kind of looking at a human face. And there are other regions of our brain that are associated with looking at objects, looking at a table, a chair, a car. And what they found is that when people are watching porn, the regions of their brain that are lighting up are the regions associated with looking at objects. So on a very real, like neurological level, we are objectifying people when we're looking at porn. We are turning them into objects that we want to acquire and, conquer in some way. I'm curious, were there other consequences that you were noticing or anything else from your story?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I recall, definitely in the period, maybe in the year or two leading up to that break and that sort of that work around porn, was this idea of desensitization.
Mm.
So when I would go onto porn websites and look for things that I felt would visually stimulate me, I'd go through periods of having specific preferences. So whether it was, certain dynamics, certain like particular genres, women looking a certain way, hair type, ethnicity, and how really it was just this idea that I was just looking for novelty because I was so consistently engaging in looking at porn. Well, something that would turn me on, maybe whether it was after a week or a month or 6 months or however long it was, at some point it would get old and it would get boring and it would not grab my attention and excite me in the same way. So that's when you have to move on to something else. And, that's human nature. Like by design, we crave novelty. And, we like new, exciting things that stimulate us in different ways. But, I think that it definitely made me, like, I think that I can't remember exactly when it was, but there was a point where I was like, what else is there? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying I went to like the the really dark, the really dark places and the kind of dark corners of the web and porn websites, but, within what I felt comfortable exploring and what I learned would turn me on. It was kind of like, what else is there? And that was probably around the point, coincidentally, that I felt I needed to have a look at this behavior. But yeah, that idea that we are always looking for novelty and like stimulation, and that is going to run out at some point. It's just how
Yeah.
things go.
Yeah. That was one of the big insights for me in breaking free was recognizing the exact same thing, recognizing that I was getting hooked on novelty. Every night when you log on and you're scrolling through and seeing thousands of different thumbnails and hundreds of different women, and you become addicted because every time there's a new face, you get that little hit of dopamine, that little excitement. On a subconscious level, you're training your brain that the thing that you desire is a new
Mm,
face. And
yeah.
it just, like you said, is this feeling of what else is there? Another kind of way of looking at this is like, when is it going to be enough? Like, when am I actually going to be satisfied? Because that's the thing. It's like there's no amount of new porn that will ever make you actually satisfied. It's this bottomless pit where you're constantly
Yeah.
searching for more and you can never fill it up. You're familiar with Gabor Mate and his work in the realm of the hungry ghosts. It comes from Buddhist philosophy, but just that realm of the hungry ghost where you're wandering around always hungry and never satisfied because you always want more, you always want different. I think a lot of men know this experience where you're attracted to some person, you think they're a 10 out of 10, and you're chasing them, you're doing everything you can, and then, finally you get with them, and it's an amazing night. The sex might be incredible, they're charming, they're laughing, they're intelligent. You're like, wow, this is great. And a few days later, a week later, you start to get a little bored. You're like, "Ah, yeah, this is great, but I just want something different." And that really just comes from that with the way that we've trained our brain and hardwired our brain for searching for novelty through porn. Um, so yeah, thanks for sharing your experience with that. I'm curious, was it what was your experience like? Like, you went through this celibacy period. Was it easy to break free from, or what were some of the things that helped you actually change your relationship to it?
Yeah, I think one of the things was that I was doing it in community. So Drew, my buddy, actually managed to pull together, I think it was about 15 guys. They were all in Australia, so I was the only British guy on a different time zone, joining these like accountability calls at 1 a.m. with all these Aussie guys. But again, porn, masturbation, these are all massive areas of shame. And of course, if you have identified that you have an addiction or a dependency or a problem with it, it's impacting your life in ways, well, there's going to be a deep amount of shame there. It's going to be really palpable. So again, not doing it alone, doing it in community, getting other guys around you, which, again, I can't necessarily speak to how easy that is, because I was just quite fortunate that someone presented an opportunity to me.
Mhm.
But I guess kind of similar to what we said earlier is go to within the safety of, your own social media pages. You can start following guys. You can follow, obviously you do some amazing work. So, there are opportunities, there are people you can learn from. But yeah, being around other people, talking about stuff, being honest. Like,
Mhm.
if you're keeping stuff in, you're not being honest. And if you're not being honest, you're not going to work through it. So, yeah, I think that was definitely the big, one of the things that I'm definitely most thankful for for that part of my journey was having brothers around me to, yeah, to like hold me in that, and for us to hold each other in that.
Yeah. I'm curious, were there any like major benefits that you saw when you went through this period of celibacy of really giving these things up? Like, what was it that convinced you, oh, okay, yeah, this actually is a healthier way to live?
Yeah, there were quite a few. In relation to my kind of self pleasure practice, because I would never call it self pleasure practice. I'd call it wanking or masturbation. So, first of all, the language around it was really, really new. When I abstained from self pleasure for those 2 weeks, I suddenly realized that I didn't actually understand or know how my body works.
Mm,
So I had been, self pleasuring in the same way that I'd learned since I was, a teenager. And I really did not understand my body. So when I began to get really kind of intentional and curious and explorative with that, um, I actually learned to. I would even go as far as saying I learned to master that element of my body and my energy. So my sex life in previous years, you know, I may have had from time to time performance related anxiety, and I would have struggled with intimacy. But generally, that's because I was up in my head and I was fearful that I needed to orgasm, I needed to come, I needed to do all these things. I should be doing this, this, and this, and so I wasn't in my body.
Mm.
And when I started spending time with my body and learning to understand it, how it works, I've now reached a point where, first of all, within my own pleasure in partnered sex, um, I know how my body works to the point where I'd confidently be able to achieve orgasm at any given point. So I have a lot more control over that than I used to. But that in and of itself means that I'm no longer end goal oriented. I'm not just
Mm.
about, just getting there. I can be far more present with my partner's pleasure. I can spend as much time as I need to and want to, and that she wants to be. I can do it for as long as I want because I'm not in this rush to get to the end. So yeah, it's kind of I've learned to connect with my own pleasure and master my own pleasure, and as a result, that's impacted my sex life, you know, massively in many positive ways.
Mm. And in terms of just your own well-being, kind of your relationship to yourself, I'm curious, has that changed at all?
Hugely. I guess it ties in with that whole element of unshaming and yeah, like when you let go of shame, you feel more connected to all of these parts of you. And whether it was part of my sexuality or my sexual expression, uh, yeah, I learned an awful lot about parts of things like I guess like my desires,
Mm.
my
Mm.
emotions, all of these parts of myself that, I mean, desires and shame is another area of huge, like of my own work. And I think that's something that a lot of men or people can struggle with, is this idea of, well, if I have desires, those desires, that you shouldn't want those things, or that's
Mhm.
dirty, or that's not okay. Um, and yeah, just learning to, yeah, like let go of shame around the way that I pleasure myself, or I, am having sex with my partner, or it makes you feel good about yourself when you realize that there's not something dirty or wrong with you or broken about you. Um, I'm speaking about this on a podcast.
Yeah.
Your audience and your listeners are going to hear about this. Like, I speak about it with you know, on my own podcast. I talk to clients about it. I speak about it online and in talks, and you know, the fact that I can do that, and of course, many people will wince or get uncomfortable around these topics, and there's no shaming of people who go through that, but the freedom I feel that I don't have to hide, and I don't have to pretend that these parts of me don't exist anymore, is liberating and freeing.
Yeah. And I think you said that the two words that were on my mind, which is freedom and liberation. And
Mm,
it's so liberating when you don't have to hide, you don't have to be ashamed of your sexuality. You can actually just embrace it and say, yeah, I'm a sexual being and these are the things I like and these are my desires. And to own it and embrace it without shame, and the liberation, the freedom that comes from that, and that you
mm.
can speak about it, on a public stage. And yeah.
Yeah, and the other benefit of it as well is that those desires that you have, those, whether it's you want to, I don't know, go to a sex party or have a threesome or explore with the same gender or whatever it is, the chances of you actualizing that desire in a way that is healthy, safe, consensual, it will only happen if you actually unshame that part of you. If you keep it in your shame, um, you will likely try to actualize that desire in kind of shadowy, harmful, in ways that you have to do it by hiding, you have to do it by deceit, you have to do it by lying, and you're going to do it in a way that causes yourself, others harm. Whereas if you are able to confidently express, here's what I like, here's what I want to do. Here's my romantic situation. Here's how I'd like to go about facilitating this desire of mine. Well, you get to go and have it, and you get to go and have it without having to hide it. You get to go and have it in a way where everyone knows what's going on, and everyone's consented and everyone's excited, and like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's amazing.
It's night and day, the difference between like engaging in some desire that you have, but like you said, you have to hide, you have to be deceitful, you feel bad about it afterwards. There's this kind of
Mm,
shame. It's not a pleasant, thriving experience versus like you say, it's like to really be able to fully enjoy your sexuality is such a gift. To enjoy it with that
mm,
freedom, that open heart of like, oh, this is beautiful. This is what I want. And you have to learn how to let go of shame and embrace your sexuality. And yeah, that's the work that we're doing here.
yeah.
I'm curious, just kind of a last question. Is there anything that you would want to tell the listeners? Anything else on your mind?
I guess just to encourage anyone who hears this, to encourage, to reassure, if anything that has come up in this conversation today, around shame, around any of the topics that maybe invokes a little bit of discomfort or fear, or that shame just gets agitated and triggered by anything that we've spoken about, um, please maybe just give yourself some compassion and be gentle with yourself and reach out. My DMs, I'm sure Jeremy's will always be open. You know, Conversations around shame can, yeah, really bring up a lot of discomfort. And um, it's a really, for me, it's some of the most challenging work that anyone can do, is to turn and face the parts of themselves that they've been running from or hiding from. And even just listening to conversations like this can bring up some of those feelings, and it can be really uncomfortable. So if that's you, and if you're currently experiencing any of those sorts of feelings, please like heed the advice and feel into what we've said around, like, share it, or at least feel safe to just drop us a DM, or you don't have to, by the way, but just please don't feel alone in it, because that's what your shame wants you to feel.
Mhm.
It wants you to hide. So do your best, and don't, because the joy and the freedom and the liberation that comes on the other side, out the other side of that, is everything.
Mm. Well said. Well said. Well, where can people connect with you? Where can they find out about you? And also, please give a plug for the podcast, which has launched just recently.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. So first of all, you can find me. Yeah, Instagram is the best place. So my handle is at @JamesOliver_men's coach. And obviously I do a lot of work with creating content and trying to help guys on whether it's shame or a whole host of different topics. So please feel free to drop me a DM, reach out if I can help in any way, or if you just want to have a chat about anything that we've talked about. And yeah, the podcast is at the Boys Toilets Podcast. So today is the 3rd of January, and the first episode literally launched this morning. So if you want to go and check that out, that would be great.
Wonderful. Well, I'm super excited to check that out myself. And I know that, we just scratched the surface on a lot of topics that I wanted to cover. So we will have you back on for another episode soon. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing some of your wisdom. It's a pleasure to have you. And thanks everyone for tuning in to another episode of Unhooked. We'll catch you guys on the next episode.